On October 7, 1945, in Luzon, the Philippines, a battered convoy of U.S. military trucks pulled up to a former Japanese barracks now converted into a makeshift American field hospital. The war was over, but the echoes still screamed in the bloodied beds and hollow stares of wounded men. Dust whipped around the wheels as the soldiers jumped down, rifles slung low, eyes sharp. They weren't expecting guests, and certainly not these guests. From the rear of the last truck, 7 Japanese nurses stepped down in silence, their faces pale, eyes lowered, uniforms worn thin by captivity. They had been found days earlier in a Philippine jungle, emaciated, terrified, and expecting execution. Instead, the order came, "Bring them here." As they stood before wounded American soldiers staring back in suspicion and disbelief, the air thickened with the weight of an unthinkable command. They were not here to be punished. They were here to help. At first, no one moved. The nurses stood frozen, their shadows long in the late afternoon light, while the murmurs among the soldiers grew louder. One corporal spat on the ground, muttering under his breath. A private stared at the nurses like they were ghosts, and perhaps they were ghosts of an enemy that had haunted their nights and taken their friends. The commanding officer, a stern man with a cracked voice and sunburned skin, stepped forward. "They'll assist in the recovery ward," he said flatly. His order settled over the room like falling ash. No salute followed. Only silence, sharpened by skepticism. One of the nurses, Nishida Haruko, just 21 years old, trembled as she clutched her satchel of worn bandages. She had trained in Hiroshima, surviving the bomb by luck or some bitter twist of fate. Now she would dress the wounds of men raised to see her as less than human. They were given no time to adjust. Within the hour, Haruko and the others were scrubbing blood from stretchers and preparing gauze with trembling fingers. One nurse, Ayaka Fujimoto, approached a bed where a young American soldier lay wrapped in fevered sweat, his leg amputated days earlier. His eyes flickered open, landing on her with instant alarm. "Don't touch me," he rasped. Ayaka froze, nodding slightly before stepping back. A medic, watching from across the tent, sighed and motioned for her to stay. "Let her try," he said. There was no softness in his voice, only exhaustion. Slowly, painfully, a strange new ritual began. The nurses moved through the corridors like phantoms of two worlds, carrying saline and sutures instead of sorrowful silence. And though fingers shook and jaws clenched tight, the dying and the healing both forced themselves to look. To see the faces of those they'd been told to hate, that was the quiet beginning of something neither side had words for. Night fell quickly over the compound, veiling the jagged outlines of tents and the broken hulls of vehicles in shadow. Lanterns cast an amber glow inside the hospital, flickering over faces gaunt with fatigue. In the dim, quiet, uniforms lost their authority, languages their separateness. Ayaka returned to the fevered soldier, her steps slow, deliberate. He said nothing this time. She lowered a damp cloth to his brow, careful not to meet his eyes. A minute passed. Then another. Finally he whispered, "It hurts less now." The nurse nodded, her throat too tight for words. In another corner, Haruko stitched the torn side of a corporal who had cursed her presence just hours before. He watched her hands, then her face, and said nothing more. Outside, a distant hymn drifted from a portable radio, Frank Sinatra, blurred by static. The war was over, but in this quiet tent, something more impossible than peace had begun. The practice of shared humanity. The days blurred together in the hospital, each sunrise marked not by reveille, but by the low groans of the wounded and the soft rustle of nurses pacing the aisles. A rhythm emerged, tentative yet growing more certain with each passing hour. The American medics no longer barked their instructions but spoke them. The Japanese nurses stopped flinching at every call. They understood each other through needle and thread, fever and hydration. Then came the first thank you. It was barely audible, spoken by a sergeant whose lungs were still ragged with infection. He grabbed Haruko's wrist weakly as she adjusted his IV. "Arigato," he whispered. She blinked, unsure if she'd imagined it. She bowed slightly without a word. The same night, Ayaka shared her last piece of hard candy with a young GI who hadn't smiled in weeks. He passed it back halved, saying, "Fair's fair." and for a moment both forgot which side they were on. But not everyone welcomed the shift. Near the edge of the compound, in a separate recovery ward, Private First Class Daniel Kessler refused care from any nurse whose accent betrayed her origin. With his left arm gone and shrapnel lodged along his ribs, he lay in constant pain, teeth gritted against both injury and memory. "My brother died at Leyte," he said to no one, "cut down by a nip bullet." When Ayaka approached his cot one morning, he turned his face toward the wall. "I don't need help from the enemy," he muttered. But hours later, as a storm thundered over the island and leaks formed in the canvas roof, it was Ayaka who stood beside him, soaking wet, holding a dry blanket and a basin of water. She said nothing. She left it on the table and vanished into the darkness. By dawn, the blanket had been pulled over his chest. The basin was empty. By the second week, silence no longer meant fear. It meant focus. In one surreal moment, Haruko and an American nurse named Marlene worked side by side, their hands stained with iodine, their gazes meeting only over the mangled arm of a Marine who had nearly bled out from a reopened wound. Marlene spoke little, her jaw tight from grief. Her fiancé had died on Iwo Jima. Yet slowly, cautiously, she passed Haruko a clamp, then a needle, then finally murmured, "Tighter on the stitch." Haruko obeyed, and together they stopped the bleeding. Outside, the tropical heat bloomed into a haze of cicada song and diesel fumes. Inside, something colder was thawing. A week earlier, the nurses had slept in a locked storage room. Now, they had cots beside the American staff. One night, someone left rice and broth on Haruko's cot, still warm. She ate with tears tracking silently into the corners of her mouth. No one claimed the kindness. No one needed to. Then came the night of the music. One of the medics, Corporal Bennett, had found an old phonograph in a supply crate, its crank stiff with rust but functional. As dusk draped the jungle, he set it up outside the medical tent, and a scratchy tango spilled into the humid air. Something shifted. Soldiers emerged slowly, gathering under lantern light. The nurses stood to the side at first, unsure whether they were welcome. But then Marlene stepped toward Haruko and held out a hand. Haruko hesitated, then gave a soft nod. With halting steps, they moved into the clearing, a lopsided two-step forming between foreign rhythms and fractured pasts. Others followed. Laughter, real, unguarded, rose against the sky. The phonograph's needle wobbled, the melody warbled, but no one cared. They danced like people waking from war. When the tango ended, silence settled again, but it carried no fear. In that moment, enemies became something else. Survivors being human together. The following morning, the hospital compound stirred with unusual stillness. Rain had fallen through the night, softening the ground, washing the blood from the paths, muting the shrieks that once echoed through every hour. Inside the main ward, Private Kessler sat upright for the first time, his face pale but changed. His eyes followed Ayaka as she moved from bed to bed, adjusting pillows, replacing bandages. When she finally reached him, he spoke before she could turn away. "You can stay," he said simply. No apology followed, no explanation, but his voice no longer bore the weight of disdain. Just fatigue and something quieter. Across the tent, a medic passed a nurse, a torn photograph, a family waiting back home. She smiled softly as she folded the corner back into place. And in that battered field hospital, forged from rubble and resentment, a truth bloomed in silence. Sometimes the heart opens not with forgiveness, but with surrender to shared pain. The war had not truly ended that day, but something in these souls had begun to mend. 3 weeks after their arrival, word spread through the compound. A team of high-ranking officers would visit the hospital to inspect conditions and write a formal report. Whispers flared like sparks, speculation in every corner. Would the Japanese nurses be sent back to captivity? Would their newfound place among the wounded be erased with the formality of a clipboard? That morning, the nurses lined up near the entrance, freshly washed uniforms clinging to narrow shoulders. Haruko's hands trembled as she adjusted her sash. Ayaka silently mouthing the name of her younger brother, killed in Okinawa. The officers arrived just after noon, stiff-backed and unreadable. They walked the wards without comment, noting beds, supplies, the organization of care. When they reached the corner where Kessler sat, he did not hide his wounds nor his nurse. Instead, he nodded toward Ayaka, then looked at the senior officer. "She saved my life," he said. A long pause followed. Then, without a word, the officer moved on. But no one missed the subtle lift of his chin, or the silent approval in his lack of protest. Later that night, the stars over Luzon emerged one by one, indifferent yet watchful. Inside the hospital, the energy had shifted, calm, yes, but heavy with uncertainty. The inspection had passed without reprimand, without praise, yet something lingered in the air, like a held breath. Haruko sat outside the tent, knees drawn to her chest, her fingers tracing patterns in the dirt. She remembered the sirens in Hiroshima, the sky splitting open, the smell of burning silk. Beside her, Ayaka hummed a lullaby their mother used to sing, a hymn from a life before uniforms, before allegiances. Across the yard, Kessler sat propped under a tree, scribbling in a torn field journal, glancing now and then in their direction. Somewhere deeper in the compound, the phonograph clicked to life again. A slow waltz drifted through the humid air. No one called for a truce. No banners were raised. But by simply existing together, in the silence after chaos, they laid something sacred between them. The possibility of grace. By the fourth week, as the monsoon rains deepened their grip on Luzon, the nurses moved not like prisoners but like staff, silent, reliable, weary. Supplies ran low. Bandages were boiled and reused, morphine rationed down to slivers of relief, but no one complained. In absence of orders, they formed their own routines, a shared language of necessity and tenderness. Ayaka began teaching a few medics how to fold origami cranes out of wrappers and old charts, symbols of hope in a place that had tasted so much ruin. Each crane was pinned above a bed, fluttering slightly with every breeze. Haruko kept a journal now, scribbled beneath the outlines of surgical trays, not in anticipation of home, but to remember. Not the pain, but the faces, the small moments of defiance against hate. One entry read in a hand as fragile as a healing wound. "We were enemies, yes, but today I held a man's hand as he died, and he said thank you." Then came the message. The nurses were to be relocated. No explanation, no timeline. Just a curt notice delivered by a junior officer, folded and unsigned. The compound fell quiet as the news traveled. The nurses said nothing. They simply kept working. That night, Haruko packed her journal, slipping it between layers of gauze like a wound still swelling. Ayaka gave her last crane to Kessler, placing it on his bedside table without ceremony. He blinked slowly, reaching out but stopping short. "Take care," he whispered, words still caught between worlds. The next morning, as dawn broke over the jungle in a haze of steam and rising light, the 7 nurses climbed back into the same truck that had brought them weeks earlier. A few soldiers stood nearby, not in protest but in witness. No farewells were spoken, but as the engine coughed to life and the truck pulled away, Kessler raised his hand. Just once. A gesture not taught by war but made possible by what followed after it. That was the last anyone at the hospital saw of them. But their names, their quiet hands, their impossible grace remained. Years later, long after new wars rose and fell, a letter arrived at a VA hospital in Ohio. It was addressed to Daniel Kessler, now aged and bound to a wheelchair, his medals tucked into boxes he no longer opened. The return address was in Japan. Inside was a single photograph, faded, grainy. The image of 7 women standing shoulder to shoulder in front of a corrugated tent. Faces solemn but untamed. Alongside it, a pressed origami crane and a page torn from a lined notebook. The handwriting, precise and spare, read, "You once let me stay, and I never forgot." No signature followed. Kessler held the paper against his chest, eyes closed, as the silence of remembered jungle rain settled around him. He could not name every face, but in that fragile image he saw something truer than victory, wider than mercy. A moment when war gave way not to peace but to the aching, unfinished work of being human. In a museum in Kyoto, tucked between relics of steel helmets and blood-stained maps, There now sits a small glass case barely large enough to fit a folded journal, a U.S. military patch, and a paper crane gone yellow from age. Few read the placard beneath it. Fewer still know that this quiet shrine marks not the memory of battle, but of something far rarer, mercy forged in aftermath. No medals were given, no official photos taken. Yet what lived between those nurses and those soldiers lingered long after treaties were signed. In every shared breath over a fevered wound, in every act of care where suspicion once stood, they rewrote a sliver of history the world had no name for. The war had been fought and won, but within one sun-stained tent in Luzon, humanity had done something scarcer. It had survived. And for anyone who noticed that small display case under dim museum lights, it whispered the truth quietly. Sometimes the bravest act is simply choosing to see the enemy as human. Back in Luzon, the old medical tent is long gone, swallowed by vines and rust, faded into the foliage where ghosts pass as shadows. Yet some locals still speak of that place. In hushed tones, they say mercy stood there once, complicated but real. A few aging villagers remember seeing the nurses walking together in the mornings, backs straight, eyes forward, never speaking unless spoken to. One man, a child then, swears he saw an American soldier and a Japanese nurse sharing rice under a banana tree, saying nothing, just chewing slowly, as though trying to digest the weight between them. The field is quiet now, humming only with insects. But under its soil sleeps a story not of battles or victory, but of kindness fought for in silence. Somewhere beneath these roots, the footprints of those who chose compassion over vengeance still remain, invisible yet eternal. And in this forgotten corner of war, that is enough. In the decades since, much of the world has chosen different narratives to remember the centuries of conflict that scarred at heroes carved in marble, victories etched in stone. But this story survives in quieter ways. In a school history book, there is a footnote about captured Japanese medics. In an American veteran's memoir, a single line, "The nurse knew my name before I remembered hers." And buried in the archives of a forgotten Red Cross report, the names of 7 women with calloused hands and unmatched poise. No bronze statues honor them. No parades march in their name. Yet for those who lived through Luzon's silent miracle, their memory does not fade, it deepens. Because it was never about absolution, it was about choice. About the harrowing, luminous decision to reach for grace in the shadow of ruin. And in that, they became something war could not define and peace could never fully explain, a testament not just to survival, but to the capacity of the wounded to heal each other. Some truths do not march through history side by side with flags and sabers, they whisper from the quiet margins. In the shade of remembered suffering, where language was broken and wounds still fresh, 7 women stepped into the teeth of what should have been vengeance and offered care instead. They asked for nothing. They were owed nothing. And yet they carried something unimaginable through that tent in Luzon, a gentleness unclaimed by allegiance. In every gaze not turned away, in every trembling hand that reached regardless of uniform, something ancient stirred. The aching knowledge that beyond borderlines and power, human need outweighs the definitions we are born into. No camera captured the moment they left. No records detailed the grace they gave. But war does not erase what kindness etches into those who survive it. And somewhere, perhaps in a folded journal, a faded photo, or an old man's memory, that truth remains soft, steady, and waiting to be remembered. And so, the story ends not with closure, but continuation. Somewhere across the ocean, a girl in modern Tokyo folds a paper crane from the corner of her school worksheet, unaware of the legacy her gesture repeats. In a Midwestern retirement home, a nurse hums an old lullaby she doesn't understand, passed down from a patient who whispered it once through tears. These threads, delicate but unbroken, tie generations not by conquest but by the fragile strands of compassion born in fire. The war's violence screamed through decades, but this story, whispered by those who refused hatred even as the world demanded it, endures like breath on glass. Brief, invisible, but real. And if one day a stranger places a crane on another's pillow, or a wounded soul reaches across history with open hands, then what those 7 nurses did in Luzon will have never truly left us. It lives on, quietly, through the choice to care when it would be easier not to. So if you ever find yourself in Luzon, far from the maps and memory of war, standing in the quiet hum of flattened ferns and rusted remnants, pause for a moment. Listen, not for gunfire or command, but for the stillness that follows mercy. Reach down and perhaps beneath the roots, you will find a fragment of gauze or a glint of glass, a whisper from those who stitched humanity back together one wound at a time. Their story won't greet you with brass bands or epics inscribed in stone. It greets you in softer ways, a folded crane on a child's desk, a shared meal without words, a lullaby sung across oceans and generations. This is not legend, it is real. And though it has no anthem, it carries the quiet power to remind us, when cruelty prevailed, 7 women chose otherwise. And in doing so, they left behind not a monument, but a map for how peace might begin, even amid ruin. Their names were never etched into marble, their story almost lost to the quiet erosion of time. Yet in the soft undercurrent of every war's aftermath, their presence endures, etched not in stone, but in hearts reshaped by moments of grace. The field where they once walked is now a thicket, nature reclaiming what men tried to destroy. Still, under that canopy of whispering leaves and fading light, the memory holds. 7 women, worn and weary, who chose to tend instead of turn away, who held shaking hands across enemy lines, not for forgiveness but for simple presence. This was no grand gesture, no cinematic finale. And yet, it may be the most human thing ever to rise in the aftermath of suffering. So as you walk through your own battles, your own recoveries, remember them. The ones who folded mercy into silence, who stitched humanity back into ruptured skin. In the end, perhaps that is our only real salvation, each other. In the quiet moments after war, history often forgets the gentlest hands. No medals gleamed on their chests, no anthems marked their departure. But for those 7 nurses, their legacy was never a matter of spectacle, it was a collection of breathless hours, of silence turned sacred, of wounds met not with weapons but with care. Their story gathered dust before it gathered recognition, scattered in the footnotes and forgotten corners of dusty archives. Yet even unremembered by textbooks, they dwell in the spaces between rage and mercy. A hand extended across ruin, a whispered thank you across language, a paper crane fluttering above a deathbed. If this tale survives, it is because it lives within the human heart's quiet rebellion against hate. The nurses never sought to change the world, but they did, not with speeches but with stitches, not with conquest but with compassion. And that quiet, enduring, fiercely human is where their true victory lies. Time does not preserve stories on its own. It requires choice. And so this one, the tale of 7 nurses who answered cruelty with compassion and expectation with grace, passes not through monuments, but through memory, in old letters stored in attic boxes, in photos with no names, only faces that refuse to vanish, in the tear of a soldier who once feared death but found instead the touch of a quiet hand that promised life. What they gave defies the categories we cling to: enemy, ally, victor, victim. They stepped beyond those lines, into something harder, something holier. Not peace, not even reconciliation, but co-suffering. The willingness to share another's agony, to relieve hurt not for history's sake, but because to turn away would have broken what remained of their own humanity. This is their final legacy. Not a war survived, but a moment redeemed. One nurse, one wounded man, one paper crane, a blueprint in ashes for how we begin again. In the deep hush of memory, stories like this do not fade, they return in quiet waves, curling back through generations who never knew their names, but feel the weight of what they chose. Somewhere a museum visitor pauses before a display case and wonders who placed that crane. Somewhere else a grandson watches his elderly relative fold paper patiently, not knowing that gesture once bridged the unbridgeable. The war that birthed nations and buried millions left behind weapons, walls, wounds, but it also left behind 7 fleeting shadows of what it means to endure without surrendering one's humanity. These were not heroes, not saints. They were nurses, once prisoners, who were handed fear and chose care, and in doing so they made a wound into a window. Look through it. The view is not clean, not triumphant, but in the tangled complexities of forgiveness and memory, you might glimpse something rarer than peace. You might glimpse the beginning of it. So let this be remembered not as a grand chapter in a military chronicle, but as a brief, flickering moment when 7 women, broken by war yet unbroken in spirit, revealed what victory could never claim: the power to choose tenderness over vengeance. Their faces are lost to official record, but their choice lingers in the breath before judgment, in the silence after pain, in the fragile art of healing the very ones who wounded you. It was not peace that found them in Luzon. It was the courage to create it where none should have existed. And though no anthem plays for those who walked unseen beside the wounded, their story endures in quieter ways. A crane folded in trembling hands, a shared bowl of rice, a wound stitched without asking who put it there. This is not the story history knew how to tell, but now perhaps it has finally been heard. Beneath the layers of war memorials and victory parades, the quiet courage of those 7 nurses endures in the overlooked spaces of remembrance. They came expecting death and gave life instead. They crossed through horrors not to claim redemption, but to offer something gentler, not forgiveness but presence. And though time has scoured their names from the loudest parts of history, in the soft contours of healing and grace they remain. If history is a tapestry of choices, then theirs stitched a thread of mercy through a pattern of ruin. Their legacy is not carved in stone but carried in subtle echoes, in lullabies that once dried tears, in hands still offering water to strangers, in memories passed down when nations no longer remember why they were once enemies. In Luzon's forgotten soil, where silence grew kinder than sound, 7 nurses taught the world a different kind of victory, one that whispers still in every act of choosing care where none is required. And perhaps that is where their story belongs, not in marble but in marrow, in us, in the choices we are left to make when the world frays at its edges, when hatred teeters on our lips but we stay our hand. In a war defined by shadows and fire, theirs was a light too quiet to parade and too sacred to forget. The 7 nurses who came to Luzon in fear, expecting punishment, instead healed both flesh and something deeper within those they tended. Their story is not grand, but it is necessary, because to recall them is to remember that even in the wreckage of history, kindness can still blaze a path through the ash. And as long as someone folds a small crane, offers care without condition, or chooses to see through the veil of enemy into the eyes of a fellow human being, then what those women did will echo long after time forgets their names. That echo, that gentleness amidst ruin, is their triumph. And when the last crane falls apart, and the final journal page turns brittle in a breath of wind, may their story still hum beneath the noise of louder tales. For in the ruins of Luzon, surrounded by mangled metal and forgotten flags, 7 nurses once chose to remain human when everything urged them not to be. They became the bridge between suffering and solace, presence and pain. This was not written in orders nor expected by survival. It was grown, one gesture at a time, in silence pregnant with unspeakable grief. If you ever lose faith in what the human heart can bear, or give, or forgive, think of them. Think of trembling hands rinsing blood without asking whose it was. Think of a paper crane tucked beside a wound. Think of kindness that expects nothing, offered to a stranger who once carried a rifle instead of a name. That is their legacy. Not a final chapter, but a beginning still unfurling quietly inside us all. So perhaps all that remains is the question we carry forward. When the moment comes, will we choose what they chose? Their story is not a relic but a reflection, a mirror we must face when mercy feels impossible. They asked for no monument, left no manifesto, but they handed us a legacy made not of banners or battle cries but of quiet endurance. 7 nurses who stepped into the aftermath of destruction and chose healing over hatred. Their names may vanish from records, but their decision echoes with each generation confronted with the choice between cruelty and compassion. Let the cranes fall, let the pages yellow and fade, but let the memory stay alive where it matters, in our capacity to care beyond divisions. In the end, that is the map they left behind, drawn not in ink but in sacrifice. And if we choose to follow it, even once, then their journey through fear into grace will never truly end but begin again in us. And so, through the smoke of battles long extinguished and the silence beneath flags grown heavy with time, their fragile legacy survives not because it is loud, but because it is true. 7 women, each marked by ruin, stepped into the very heart of the enemy's grief and laid down not resistance but relief. What they offered could not be tallied in reports or saluted on parade grounds. It was smaller, stranger, more essential. A gesture here, a glance there, the steadfast courage to treat pain without measuring blame. Time may forget where that field once stood or blur the lines that separated friend from foe. But it cannot erase what those nurses chose in the stillness after war, to remain human. That choice, made again and again in the quiet corners of conflict, is how healing truly begins. Not with treaties, not with endings, but with one wounded soul daring to care for another even when the world says not to. And thus the story of those 7 nurses concludes without ending, resonating not with fanfare but with the soft persistence of memory. Their journey through captivity, suspicion, and unspeakable tenderness is not the tale of nations, but of people. People who, when stripped of everything, country, safety, pride, chose not vengeance but presence. In them we see the quiet architecture of hope built under fire. They were not saints, not soldiers, but something more difficult. Healers in a world torn by wounds of the heart as much as the body. And though their names drift like ash beyond the grasp of history books, their spirit lingers wherever empathy triumphs over enmity. One wound at a time, one kindness without reason, one gesture unreturned, they repaired what war had shattered. And if, in some future hour, someone chooses mercy when rage would be easier, then perhaps the cranes will keep flying, and the scarred field of Luzon will bloom again, not with flags but with remembrance. Because stories like theirs are not meant to be finished, they are meant to echo. Echo in the way a wound carries memory. In the lull after suffering when kindness breathes again. Somewhere in Luzon, beneath the moss, heavy canopy, and rusted memories of war, 7 nurses chose to remain human. That choice did not end with their departure or even with their passing. It threads forward in small acts, in hands reaching across grief, in voices breaking barriers not with speeches but songs. When the world forgets, the cranes remember. When the record books exclude, the soil keeps their steps. And maybe that is the only testament they ever asked for, to be remembered not with monuments but with meaning. So let their story live not in marble but in every quiet moment when someone chooses compassion not because it is easy, but because it is right. That is the legacy of the nurses of Luzon. Not an ending, but a prayer whispered forward. And if you listen closely in that quiet prayer, you might hear the echo of bandages unraveling, of hands once bound now offering healing instead of harm. The story of the 7 nurses who walked through ruin in Luzon does not belong to any one people, nor is it bound by time. It is a reminder soft as breath, sharp as memory, that war may take, but it cannot unmake the soul's resilience. What they gave defies conquest. What they carried no vault can hold. And so while the world continues to raise monuments to empires and battles, let this simple truth remain beneath it all. 7 women arrived expecting death and chose instead to give life not once but every day they remained. In silence, in sorrow, in service. Long after the tents are gone, long after names are lost and voices fade, their story endures in the sacred spaces between us, where healing still dares to begin. So let the cranes fall silent, their folds loosened by time, their colors dimmed by weather and years. Let the soil of Luzon reclaim the paths worn by footsteps that once moved with fear, then purpose. But do not let the story vanish. For in every war there are names never recorded, faces never remembered, and acts of mercy that history overlooks. Yet these moments, too quiet for headlines, too rare for repetition, are the true victories. They remind us that even amid ruin the spirit can still rise. That when hatred sets the stage, there is always space for someone to choose otherwise. The 7 nurses did not change the world. They simply refused to let the world change them. And in that defiance, wrapped in tenderness, they left behind something enduring, not an anthem but a question. When everything burns, will you still choose to care? In the hush that follows violence, their answer waits, steady and soft, yes. Because when history forgets to speak, stories like this become the breath between its silences. The nurses of Luzon came and went like wind through torn canvas, their legacy not preserved in monuments but in the marrow of remembered tenderness. Theirs was not a story of conquest or glory, but of soft rebellion, of compassion offered with nothing to gain, of kindness stitched into the very fabric of agony. In the end, the paper cranes curl inward, the journals fade to inkless whispers, and the jungle reclaims what man once shattered. But even so, perhaps, especially so, a truth remains, that in a war built on division, 7 women chose unity without words, that even in captivity they offered care, that when handed hate, they extended gentleness, and though we may never know each of their names, we carry them forward every time we choose to listen, to tend, to see the person, not the past. That is enough. That is remembrance. And so, at the edge of memory, where truth is too tender for textbooks and too sacred for silence, their story meets its quiet end. Not with applause, not with fanfare, but with the soft press of memory into the soul. 7 Japanese nurses, once captives, once enemies, walked into a war's aftermath with trembling feet and left behind a trail of healing that none could undo. Their faces are lost, their voices stilled, but their choice to tend instead of turn, to trust in humanity over history, remains. In every act of care unseen, in every small mercy passed unspoken, their spirit stirs. And though the years have drawn a veil across Luzon's soil, beneath it their legacy breathes still, pulsing not with war's echo, but with grace. For even when the world breaks, there are those who kneel among the shards and begin, quietly, to mend. That is how healing begins. That is how war learns to end. So let it end here, not as a conclusion but an offering. The war is long over, the guns silenced, the names faded into the bylines of forgotten dispatches. But in the hollow where the tents once stood, where kindness broke rank and mercy disobeyed fear, something eternal was planted. It does not need headlines, it does not beg for canonization. It exists in dim corners of memory, in the choice to hold a hand when history says to turn away. The nurses of Luzon walked into the heart of aftermath and left something behind, not just healing but a legacy 1,000 battles could not destroy. A moment where humanity chose itself. In that we find not a story about war but a testament to its opposite. And as the final crane is folded, offered, and left to rest where wounds once bled, we are reminded, the smallest choice to care can echo louder than any victory. That echo, that is the story, that is enough. And maybe in the end that is what history has always needed most. Not heroes bristling with weapons, but hands willing to heal. In the quiet where memory fades, and monuments crumble back to stone and soil, their presence endures not in legend, but in the gentle defiance of the human spirit. The 7 nurses of Luzon walked a path lined with suspicion, fear, and grief, yet carried no shield but empathy. They were never meant to be known, yet they revealed something we must never forget, that the fiercest resistance is sometimes not fought, but offered gently, without demand. Each stitch, each folded crane, each moment of care was not an answer to war but a question posed to the future. What will you choose when it matters most? That question remains fragile, human, alive. And as long as someone somewhere chooses healing over harm, the nurse's story will not end. It will echo forward, whispered, carried, chosen, again. So remember them not only in memorials but in moments, in the pause before judgment, in the quiet offer of care, in the choice to cross even the smallest distance between pain and kindness. The 7 who once arrived in fear and left behind something stronger than war. They were nurses, yes, but more than that, they were the fragile thread that bound 2 broken worlds into a single breath of grace. Their legacy is not bound to history's timelines or the banners of nations, but to the simple, eternal truth. When all seemed lost, they chose to give, not because they had to, but because they couldn't not. And as long as pain exists, as long as we can still choose to answer it with compassion, then what happened in Luzon will live on not as myth, but memory, breathing, waiting, teaching us again and again what it means to be human. So let the final silence fall, not as an absence, but as an echo of all that was chosen in defiance of fear. Let it settle softly over the field where 7 hands once stitched and soothed, where pain met presence and history was quietly rewritten. Their story does not fade, it deepens, woven not through speeches or monuments, but through the trembling courage of choosing care where cruelty once ruled. In remembering them, we remember ourselves at our most vulnerable, and perhaps our most brave. For it was not the war that defined them, but what they chose after it. As generations pass and history tilts toward forgetting, may someone still pause to fold a crane, to whisper a thank you, to offer a hand without needing to know a name. That is how we honor them. Not by remembering what they endured, but by continuing what they began, healing quietly where no one expects it. And that, at last, is enough. And thus, in the lingering hush that follows stories almost too tender to endure, we leave the nurses of Luzon not in finality, but in quiet purpose. Their steps have long faded into the soil, their names scattered to wind and time, but what they carried refuses to die. In every paper crane gently folded in a world still fractured, in every act of unseen kindness offered without flag or motive, their spirit takes shape again. This was not a tale of warfare, but of insistence on gentleness, on presence, on staying human, even when every wound beckoned rage. In surrender, they did not lose, they taught us to win differently. And as the last lights dim over this story, may we carry its ember within us. For when fear returns and hatred knocks again, the memory of those 7 nurses will whisper as it always has, not loudly, but enough. Choose care anyway. So as the screen fades to black, let us not turn away, but inward toward the fragile, luminous echo left by 7 women who once stepped barefoot into the ashes of war with nothing but their mercy. Their names may elude us, their faces dim behind history's haze, but the grace they carried lingers in each trembling act of humanity chosen against all odds. Luzon may be silent now, but its soil remembers. And if ever we doubt the reach of compassion, let us return here in spirit, to that sun-struck tent where sorrow met solace and former enemies faced one another not across trenches but through touch. This then is how some wars truly end, not with treaties signed, but with hands quietly held. In the echo of those footsteps, stained and steady, may we too find the strength to choose kindness over rage, presence over vengeance. The cranes have flown, but their flight, that fragile arc of human grace, remains forever in motion. And so, finally, the story returns not to history books or grand halls, but to us, to the breath between conflict and choice. The nurses of Luzon remind us that healing is not a singular act, but a succession of small, quiet decisions made in the aftermath of disaster. Their footsteps may be gone, but the echo they left does not waver. It lives in each of us, in how we meet pain with presence, sorrow with softness, hatred with patience. Perhaps we never needed statues to remember them, only the willingness to carry forward what they began. One wound at a time, one hand extended, one moment of mercy beside the ruins. And if that grace reaches even one more heart, softened by its memory, then their legacy remains untouched by time. The war ended, but what they offered, the fierce, fragile insistence on humanity, will never fade. Let that be the final word. They chose care, and because of it, so can we. So let this be where it ends, quietly, wholly, with reverence, not in spectacle but in stillness. The story of 7 women who walked out of captivity into uncertainty and left behind not bitterness but balm. They did not seek recognition, yet they became the quiet architects of something larger than survival. In a world torn by lines and flags, they wove invisible threads between hearts. We may not remember their names, but we carry their choice. The choice to step forward when retreat was safer, to tend when the easier path was to turn away. That choice remains ours now, folded deep into the hush that follows every cruel history. And in the smallest, most human gesture, a glance, a hand, a whispered thanks, we keep their story alive. One paper crane lifted not by wind but by memory. That is enough. It always has been.